Steve Nash is a 6'3" point guard that quarterbacked the offense that helped revolutionize the game of basketball. An offense that not only changed the NBA as we know it, but also changed Steve Nash's career pretty significantly in the mid-2000s with the Phoenix Suns. And throughout Steve Nash's time in the NBA, he would finish his career off with multiple All-Star appearances, multiple selections to the All-NBA teams, 2 MVPs, led the NBA in assists 5 different years, and in his career with the 3rd most assists in NBA history, which obviously gave him a resume that allowed him to be inducted into the Basketball Hall of Fame. And even though Steve Nash was an amazing player and he was great to watch, as I spent majority of my youth growing up watching Steve Nash almost endlessly, it is something to be said about his career and the level of criticism that is constantly circling his play when he was with the Phoenix Suns and even with the Dallas Mavericks. And to be completely honest with you all, I believe a lot of the criticism that surrounds Steve Nash is extremely valid. And after watching a few videos from my peers and looking at a few responses on a couple of polls that I've released over the past 2 weeks now, I have to admit I'm starting to feel way more comfortable in saying that Steve Nash is slowly starting to become one of the more overrated players in the last 10 to 15 years, largely due to the fact that so many people excuse or act as if like there isn't any valid criticism behind his career.
In that system, a bunch of players look really good, Kenny.
Now, one interesting fact about Steve Nash's career is how late it took Steve Nash to truly take off. Now, don't get me wrong, there were definitely some years in Dallas, especially the last 3 to 4 years, where Steve Nash possessed the talents and skills to be the same player that we saw in Phoenix. However, it is very, very interesting that Steve Nash in his career didn't take off until he was 30 years old and being coached by Mike D'Antoni, which leads multiple people to believe that Steve Nash is just a system player and that he heavily benefited by playing in an offense that obviously was going to significantly alter a lot of players' numbers, including Steve Nash. Now again, I want to be clear about this. Steve Nash was always a really, really good and talented player, even in Dallas. But the one thing that is extremely interesting and something that too many people need to stop denying is that Steve Nash has only been able to flourish while playing under a very specific style of basketball, which is an offense that features an up-tempo pace and a lot of floor spacing around Steve Nash. Now, even as I say this, I really and truly don't believe it's that big of a deal that Steve Nash was a system player, largely due to the fact that there have been a lot of players throughout the history of the sport who have significantly benefited while playing under a specific type of coach or while playing in an offense that catered to their strengths while hiding their weaknesses. However, the bigger problem comes when Steve Nash and his impact on the team took a significant decline once he was taken out of his comfort zone, such as when the Phoenix Suns decided to bring in Shaquille O'Neal and the team saw a significant change in style of play, especially after they lost Mike D'Antoni around this time as well, and unfortunately in the 2009 season they missed the playoffs entirely. Further proof of this is the lack of impact that Steve Nash would have in multiple playoff appearances when the opposing team would change the pace of the game, which would alter the impact that Steve Nash could possibly have on his team winning. So yeah, there's definitely some validity to that argument.
You're not no MVP, you're a good point guard.
Another form of criticism that constantly surrounds Steve Nash in his career is the validity of his 2 MVPs that he won in 05 and 06. Because as we all know, statistically speaking, outside of the efficient shooting numbers that Steve Nash was recording, he wasn't putting up numbers that were so eye-opening that would validate him winning the MVP. And we also know at that time, Steve Nash was not the best player in the NBA. Matter of fact, we're just talking about skills and talents. He wasn't even a top 3 or top 5 player in the league at that time. And when it comes to Steve Nash and these MVPs, they play a very pivotal role in his career, because I honestly believe if Steve Nash did not win those MVPs, I don't think he would be in a Hall of Fame, especially when I see a player such as Ben Wallace struggle to get inducted. However, as we all know, numbers and how great of a player you are skill and talent wise isn't necessarily correlated to you winning the MVP or not. We all know that the MVP has a lot more to do with impact, narrative, and storylines that the media tends to make up during the regular season, and because of this, I really and truly don't care about the MVP and the award itself. And if I have to be transparent, I believe that Steve Nash should have won at least one MVP, but 2006 is just ridiculous. Even if we exclude LeBron and Kobe Bryant from that conversation, Dirk Nowitzki checks off all the boxes that is needed to check off for him to win MVP that season. However, I don't like to deal in hypotheticals, and the facts are just the facts. Steve Nash is indeed a two-time MVP winner. And for the people out there who support and defend Steve Nash about his MVPs, let's treat him like a two-time MVP winner then. And as a two-time MVP winner, we're gonna hold him to the same level of responsibility that we held every other two-time MVP winner. Matter of fact, we're gonna hold him to the same responsibility of players who haven't even won 2 MVPs. And that responsibility is to win a championship, or at bare minimum, make the NBA Finals, which Steve Nash never did. So that leads me to the question, if Steve Nash is so great of a player to validate the 2 MVPs that he won, how is it that he never made it to the NBA Finals? Now, I'm not going to sit here and lie to you guys. This is part of the video where I get in my bag, because for whatever reason, and I really don't know why, the same people who are so quick to defend Steve Nash and the 2 MVPs that he won and claim that he won them fair and square and that he's an extremely impactful player are the same ones who are quick to make excuses for this 2-time MVP winner. But before we get into his years in Phoenix, let's talk about what happened in Dallas, because for whatever reason, and I really don't understand how this has happened over the course of the last 15 to 20 years, but Steve Nash is a player who spent 18 years in the NBA. But for whatever reason, we only talk about a 3 to 5 year stretch in Phoenix and act like his years in Dallas never existed. And there's a good reason for this, because when you look at his years in Dallas, he has a lot of questionable playoff performances, such as 2001 when the Dallas Mavericks matched up against the Spurs and Steve Nash underperformed significantly. And also in 2002 and 2003, we're going to put a little bit more context into this as well. Steve Nash played really good in both of those years in the postseason, and in my opinion, in 2003, they would have made it to the NBA Finals if Dirk didn't suffer an injury in the Western Conference Finals against the Spurs. But what happened in 2004 is unexcusable, because like I stated before, they made it all the way to the conference finals in 2003. Dirk was entering his prime, Michael Finley was still a constant contributor, and Steve Nash at this point in his career was arguably one of the top 3 point guards in the NBA, so he was far from a slouch. So when the Dallas Mavericks set their expectations to make the NBA Finals and not only bring back the same team, but add in more offensive pieces such as Antoine Jameson and Antoine Walker, drafted Josh Howard and Marquise Daniels, you would assume that this is a team that was going to make it to the finals. But unfortunately, they were knocked out in the first round when they matched up against a Sacramento Kings team that had C-Webb rushing back to play with his team after suffering an injury that kept him sidelined for the rest of the postseason last year and majority of the regular season, so he wasn't 100%, and Stojakovic underperformed in this playoff series as well, as Steve Nash would average 13 to 14 points, 9 assists, but shot below 40% from the field. Now you would argue, well, he only shot poorly from the field, he still posted up the numbers, but see, that's the problem with Steve Nash. Steve Nash has to be amazing offensively because how poorly he is on the defensive end. Because when you look at what Mike Bibby posted up in that series, 24 points, 3 to 4 rebounds, 4 to 5 assists, 2 steals, while shooting 48% from the field and 52% from behind the arc, then you definitely get a little bit more context on why exactly Steve Nash has to be extremely efficient. But to give you even more context, in Game 5 in this exact same series, Steve Nash started off that game playing amazing. Unfortunately, in the fourth quarter, Steve Nash only posted up 2 points, 3 assists, 3 turnovers, shot 1 for 6 from the field, and 0 for 1 from behind the arc. Mind you, the Sacramento Kings won this game by 1 point. So yeah, that's the reason why many people love to just sweep those years underneath the rug when it comes to Steve Nash. But hey, I guess Steve Nash, technically speaking, wasn't an MVP at that time, so I guess we're going to hold him to a different standard. But what happened in Phoenix is something that, again, I just don't understand. And if you're a two-time MVP winner, you definitely should be able to make it to the finals at least once during this stretch of years. Because if we're going to be honest with ourselves, Steve Nash played with a plethora of talented pieces. This idea that Steve Nash needed more help or he didn't have the talent around him to win a championship is nonsense. If we're going to be completely honest with ourselves, Steve Nash played with arguably the most talented team in the NBA at that time. For the first 3 to 4 years with the Phoenix Suns, Steve Nash played with 2 All-NBA performers in Amari Stoudemire and Shawn Marion. And then for the rest of the lineup, it was a whole bunch of players who fit well into the system. And again, you would argue that they had one of the most talented teams in the NBA, as they had Joe Johnson and Quentin Richardson on the perimeter in Steve Nash's first year with the Phoenix Suns in 05, and then after that they replaced Joe Johnson and Quentin Richardson with Raja Bell and Boris Diaw, which in my opinion, both of those players are better fits for that team. Also, let's not forget they had Barbosa coming off the bench, who eventually won 6th Man of the Year, and then as well they had a coach in Mike D'Antoni, who not only won Coach of the Year in 2005 and was a consistent candidate to win Coach of the Year, but obviously put a system around Steve Nash that highlight his strengths as much as possible. So then that forced me to ask, what more does a 2-time MVP winner needs to make it to the NBA Finals? Also, for the people out there who want to point out this idea that the organization royally screwed over Steve Nash because they were quote-unquote cheap due to the fact that they just allowed Joe Johnson to be traded to the Atlanta Hawks, let's give a little bit more context into that situation. Joe Johnson, when he was with the Phoenix Suns, was the 4th best player on the team, and when it came to him going to Atlanta, they was paying him roughly around $12 to $15 million. For those out there who don't know, at that time, Joe Johnson was literally getting paid just a few $1,000,000 less than Kobe Bryant. Again, he was the 4th option. Not only that, for people out there who don't know or just don't care to realize, the organization still had to pay Amari Stoudemire due to the fact that he was on his rookie deal. So obviously, Stoudemire, being the 2nd best player on that team, was prioritized over Joe Johnson. So again, let's not forget about that fact. But also, they replaced Joe Johnson with Raja Bell, who not only was a great 3-point shooter and was nearly producing the same level of efficiency as Joe Johnson, but was a better fit for the organization since he was an elite level defender. And speaking of defense, let's also talk about this idea that they never put Steve Nash on a team with elite level defenders, because that is also a lie. Steve Nash played 3 years with both Raja Bell and Shawn Marion, 2 elite level defenders. But also, when it comes to the Phoenix Suns as a team, their defensive rating was never atrocious. Around that time, they were roughly an average defensive team. But if we are going to be honest with ourselves, a huge reason why they were such a questionable defensive team largely has to do to Steve Nash's inability to play defense. So now that we know that Steve Nash was on an extraordinarily talented team, he was with an organization that was willing to spend the money. And for the people out there who are still questioning this, by the 2007 season, the Phoenix Suns had one of the highest payrolls in the NBA, so again, I don't understand where that's coming from. And furthermore, they had the defensive pieces around him that fit well in that system. Again, that forces me to ask, what more does a 2-time MVP winner needs to win a championship? But lo, you have to use context. So let's use context on a year-to-year basis, because the one thing I constantly hear about Steve Nash and his inability to win is either A, he was always losing to the San Antonio Spurs, or B, he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, or he got quote-unquote robbed of his opportunities. As many people would start to use excuses such as 2006, without Amari Stoudemire, there was no way that they were going to be able to make it to the finals, which isn't true whatsoever. They were able to avoid the San Antonio Spurs in the playoffs and made it all the way to the conference finals without Amari Stoudemire. So again, let's not marginalize how great he is. He was able to make it all the way to the conference finals and match up against a Dallas Mavericks team that even still, without Amari Stoudemire on his roster, they were lacking in talent compared to the Phoenix Suns. If you look at the amount of help that was surrounding both Dirk and Nash, you could easily tell who had more help on their roster, but again, people are just going to look at the numbers and say, well, Steve Nash actually played fine in that series, so what is your point? My point is, if you actually watch that series, you would clearly tell in 3 pivotal games, especially in the fourth quarter, Steve Nash did not show up, especially in game 2, where not only in the fourth quarter did he only attempt 1 shot, but in the entire second half, he was only held to 1 field goal attempt. Also, for the people out there who point out in 2007 he was robbed because in game 5 they suspended Amari Stoudemire and they wanted the San Antonio Spurs to win, again, please spare me, because it's very obvious that you didn't even watch that game. Because if you did watch that game, you would thoroughly understand in game 5, the Phoenix Suns, even without Amari Stoudemire, were still dominating the San Antonio Spurs for majority of that game. Matter of fact, there was a 5, almost 6-minute stretch where the San Antonio Spurs were scoreless, and the Spurs, who only won that game by 3 points, did not take the lead until there was 36 seconds left to go in the game. Do you know what happened? In the first 3 quarters, Steve Nash was dominant. 14 points, 9 rebounds, and nearly shot 50% from the field. In the fourth quarter, when they needed him the most, and again, when the San Antonio Spurs were able to grab the lead with 36 seconds left to go in the game, Steve Nash posts up 5 points, 3 assists, while shooting 1 for 8 from the field and 1 for 5 from behind the arc. And oh yes, for people out there who don't know, the person who was left wide open to make the 3-pointer to give the Spurs a lead was Bruce Bowen, who was Steve Nash's assignment. Also, for the people who make it seem like the San Antonio Spurs were this unbeatable team, please spare me. Around the same time, Kobe Bryant beat the San Antonio Spurs in 2008 with just an all-star on his team and Pau Gasol, and even in that series in the conference finals, it's not like Pau played all that well. Matter of fact, Lamar Odom didn't even play that well in that series, and somehow, some way, Kobe Bryant still was able to find a way to beat the San Antonio Spurs. And oh yes, also for the people out there who love to use a suspended excuse, in 2006, the Dallas Mavericks, led by Dirk, were able to beat the San Antonio Spurs despite the fact that Jason Terry was suspended for 1 game. I know you're going to sit here and tell me that Jason Terry and Amari Stoudemire, they're not the same player, especially at that time where Stoudemire was at his peak. However, Jason Terry was the second best player for Dirk at that time, so I think that speaks volumes in and of itself. But again, Dirk was able to find a way to beat the Spurs despite having one of his players suspended for 1 game. And also for people out there who don't know, Steve Nash was able to beat the San Antonio Spurs in 2010, so it's not like it was impossible. Steve Nash actually did it at some point in his career, but eventually in 2010, he lost to Kobe Bryant. I already know what people are going to sit here and say, oh man, that was a prime Kobe, so you got to give him some slack. But in the very next season, Dirk, without any All-NBA performer, was able to not only beat that same Kobe Bryant team, but was able to sweep them. Now I already know what some of y'all are going to say. We already know that Steve Nash isn't as great as Dirk or Kobe Bryant. However, at the time when Steve Nash was winning those MVPs and leading that team to 50 to 60 wins on a consistent basis, there were some people who actually believed that Steve Nash was indeed better than Kobe, and there were definitely a lot of people who believed that Steve Nash was better than Dirk, especially when Steve Nash was able to leave the Dallas Mavericks and immediately make it to the conference finals in his first year on a team that in the previous season won only 29 games. And when he won another MVP in the very next season, it only validated his impact on that team and his greatness in the league. And see, that's really the problem with Steve Nash. As much as I really and truly like Steve Nash, and let's please not ever get it twisted, I got a Steve Nash jersey hanging up in my closet right now. But even I must admit, Steve Nash, when he was in Dallas, he had a really good career. And because he was a free agent at the right moment, at the right time, when another organization desperately needed a point guard, while also changing the way that they were going to run their offense, Steve Nash turned a good career to a Hall of Fame one. Because if we're going to be honest with ourselves, if Steve Nash had played with any other coach, with any other system, with any other players around him, after he concluded his tenure with the Dallas Mavericks, let's keep it a buck, you would not know who Steve Nash is. And so when I hear people who are in denial about him being a system player or act as if he was the system with the Phoenix Suns, when the reality is Steve Nash probably has benefited way more than anybody else on that team while being coached under that D'Antoni system, especially when people excuse his inability to make it to the NBA Finals and just consistently talk about his 18-year career through a 5-year lens, to the point where some people have convinced others that he didn't have enough help on arguably the most talented team in the NBA during the mid-2000s. But with that being said, people, please let me know what you think about Steve Nash in the comment section below. And until next time, I'll see you all later. Peace.
So you telling me Steve Nash was the best in the NBA in 2 years in a row?
Yes, 100%.